All right, let's get this started.
Okay.
To all the listeners at bigyan.org.in and Dr. Alexis with us here, a very warm welcome. Dr. Alexis is a PhD in molecular genetics from the Rockefeller University and currently an assistant professor of biology and film at NIU Abu Dhabi. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
We actually wanted to know, what was the genesis of your movie, The Fly Room?
Well, I started my scientific career working on Drosophila research at Rockefeller, and I became very interested in that model organism. I was initially working, doing more behavioral work on circadian rhythms, and then I ended up doing my PhD in a laboratory that focused on the visual system and understanding visual coding, visual processing in Drosophila. And it's actually through my research on vision, on flies, that I became interested in cinema, and I started making a few films with the fly as the main protagonist of the film, and this is really where I started kind of dreaming about all kinds of different types of films and the beginning of a budding film career in science filmmaking.
So science filmmaking clearly was your choice. How important do you think science communication is to society?
It's very important, and I think the most important aspect about science communication is that it needs to be as varied as possible. I think it's important that people understand that science communication can come in many ways, and it's also important to strike a balance between reaching a wide audience and making it entertaining, and not always having in mind this kind of worry that people have to necessarily understand everything, or this idea that you have to simplify science or break it down or create kind of cliches about science. So for me, it's very important. I don't make films with science communication in mind. I make films to tell stories, and I just happen to be very compelled by stories in science and stories about scientists, and this is where I'm drawing most of my inspiration right now.
So what is your preferred media and style? So do you prefer video to audio? Is there any benefit to either? And what style is preferred? Do you think a fictionalized version of the truth is better than, say, a documentary style? Why?
Well, I teach a class at, you mentioned that I was at NYU Abu Dhabi. I teach a class called docufiction. And, the idea is that there is no such thing as a documentary film that has no bias in terms of how it's presented, and there is no such thing as a fictional film that is not grounded on documentary. So when we talk about fictionalized reality, I mean, we're all trying to, whether it's a documentary or a fictional film, we're trying to recreate reality. And in some cases we say it's fiction. In other cases we say, oh, this is a documentary, but it's also staged, right? We're interviewing people, we're creating analogies with images. So that division is something that I try to fight as much as possible. But what I'm most interested in, I'm interested in both, and it's an important point actually, because I'm interested in how image and sound can sometimes not always be in sync, but provide different layers to how we see something. And I'm actually, when I shoot a film, I'm very focused on sound, and I think about, with this film, there's a lot of sounds of flies, and I recorded actually sounds of flies with these contact microphones, and it's something that I think about a lot with the composer, also the music. I don't want it to ever feel like music, but more ambience. So these are things that I think about separately and how they come together.
Yeah. So what would you suggest to practicing scientists as well as aspiring science communicators to pursue in order to sort of not just do research but also convey the message to society at large? What do you think they should do? What tips do you think you could give them?
Yeah, I mean, there's no one way of doing things, right? I think as a scientist, you have to be as communicative as possible about your research and about what you do, whether it's, talking to your friends, whether it's through your writing, whether it's, maybe doing more, video or radio shows. from my experience, I think what really attracts people is when you start talking about why you're personally interested in science, the personal stories, and how your research may relate to your life in some way. Why do you study, this specific field? Why are you attached to this specific model organism? You'll speak to some scientists and they'll talk hours about their fascination with fish and yeast or zebra fish or C. elegans. I mean, it's amazing, the passion that they have. And I think that's really how it's also about your target audience, who you're reaching. And I think it's important to move away from this idea that you need to necessarily talk about results, it's also important to talk about the process. Right. What does it mean to do science every day? What does it mean to do basic research that doesn't necessarily have any medical implications and I think that's something that people have a hard time understanding. So,
like following a fundamental curiosity.
Yeah, and as an artist would do with sculpture or painting, and I think that's, it's coming down to that. And so that's what I try to do when I talk about my research. And I talk a little bit about my transition from science to film. I say, it was my interest in the visual system that got me interested in cameras, and I'm interested in how the eye sees and how we interpret images and all that. So that's kind of my stories.
Right. So you talk about how important it is to convey to people your a researcher's fascination with science, right? But there is a large number of people who don't speak the common medium of science, that is English. Whereas in places like China and Japan, science communication happens in local languages. What do you think is the value of communicating science in a regional language in addition to English? And how do you think it affects scientific awareness in non-English speaking societies?
Well, it's a good question. I think that that the way we communicate science and the languages we use to communicate science also is part of what the science is about. I think that we have this thing where English has become the common language to communicate science, but the language, the way we present the research, the language, the use of the language, also has an effect on how we interpret the research, the data, and I think that also adds so much richness to the research. So I would be, I would love to see more videos, and actually in videos, this is a big problem. That science filmmaking is oftentimes, English is the only language that's kind of accepted or tolerated. And I think it's important to show, whether it's language, whether it's how we depict a cell in different cultures, how do we do scientific illustrations. This may change from culture to culture. And I think, of course, there needs to be some consensus. But I think that
on the facts.
Although facts, there's so much that we still don't understand. So, but I think it's important to also embrace kind of all of these layers and differentiation between cultures and how they approach science. So.
Actually, we're looking forward to this the movie, The Fly Room, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that very soon. Could you tell us a little about your upcoming projects so that we can keep an eye out for them?
Yeah, I mean, I share my time between teaching film biology and also organizing a film festival, which is all about presenting science in many ways, but my main focus is filmmaking, and I'm very interested. It's filmmaking is something that the more you do it, and the more you actually watch your film with different audiences, the more it actually gives you ideas about what to do next, and it's amazing to show it in different settings. I've shown the film in Iran versus like south of the U.S. I mean, it's very different reactions, and so
could you tell us a little more about how different they were?
Well, there's some censorship, sometimes there's some fascination with certain details if you show it to a science crowd versus they pick up on some details in the film. So I'm continuously intrigued by that, but one of my fascinations right now is using animals, two things: using animals as actors, where their perspective becomes part of the film, which you'll see a little bit. It's very little in this film, where the fly has an actual perspective on how the world looks like. And so there's that, and also having scientists be in the film, play different roles in the film, especially for science films. I think it's important because it adds credibility to the dynamic. My next film, I have 2 films. My next one is about memory, and actually about research on rats. Part of the brain called the amygdala, and how the amygdala kind of bridges emotion and memory. But the film is about a scientist that starts confusing his work on fear conditioning and studying memory with the relationship with his father. And he starts seeing his father as a rat.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, and so then he then is obsessed with the idea of recreating his own memories using rats. So he has rats play his father and himself, and he becomes so obsessed that he, things go out of hand, and I'll leave it to that. And then another film is about Evo Devo and about monarch butterflies, based on some work by Sean Carroll, who's been a big supporter of my work. But these longer films take a long time, many years. So I also make short format films, and I'm making a film in a few weeks about mangroves, and about mangrove fairy tales, Emirati folk tales combined with mangrove conservation. And so this is what I do. I kind of make all kinds of films,
Your projects sound truly fascinating. We look forward to seeing them. Okay. From the listeners of bigyan.org.in, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.